Hi, welcome back. In this video, we're going to talk about history of psychology. Before we move on with this topic, I would like to give you a quick review of what we discussed in the last video. And not everything, but the most important idea was we tried to define psychology as a study of human behavior. And we said that human behavior has both external and internal aspects to it. External aspect refers to the external behavior, the things that you can observe, whereas internal refers to the things that you can't observe, and these are specific to what we term as mental processes. These are unobservable behaviors of human mind or humans. Just so you also remember from the big picture, we said that there are three topics, or at least three categories of topics that we'll discuss in this class. One is about the basics, which is about history, methods, and the biological basis of behavior. The second one is the mental processes, which include sensation, perception, attention, memory, and learning. Then the third category of things, as we said, would be about emotions and meaning in life. Today, we'll talk about basics, and specifically, we'll talk about the history of psychology in that. Now, according to Ebbinghaus, who's a well-known and a significant contributor in the field of memory, according to him, psychology has a very long past, but only a short history. What it means is that people were interested in human mind a long time ago, but they recently did they start adapting scientific methods to study them. In other words, people were interested from the past, but systematic observations only started recently. That's what it means by having a long past, but only a short history. The question is how long? Well, it dates back to a philosophical period, or we call it as a pre-scientific period, around 500 BC. And how short a history? Well, you can trace back to late 19th century. So the objectives or the outcomes for today would be discuss a brief history of psychology. And when we do so, we're basically looking at how and when people got interested in psychology or human mind, and how it changed from being a purely philosophical construct to a more scientific one. Now, while we discuss this, I want you to keep this in mind, have this general theme in mind, or the context in which we discuss. It's about how people conceptualize human mind before adapting scientific methods and after adapting scientific methods. In other words, more philosophical views of it and more scientific views of it, of human mind. And also, what has happened? Has the perspectives of studying human mind changed after adapting a scientific method in late 1800s, or it remained the same? That's what we'll discuss when we talk about the history of psychology in this video. So let's talk about the brief history here. To give you a nutshell, to make it simpler, I kind of like it to divide the history of psychology into different periods or different time zones. The first of those would be pre-scientific. It's a philosopher's time. It's between like 500 to 300 BC. This is a time where people were interested, but they didn't adopt any scientific methods. Then it would be a scientific period where there were some, especially in the mid 1800s or mid 19th century, when there were some discoveries that led or inspired people in the or people who were interested in human mind to adapt scientific methods, but they did not start studying human mind, adapting these methods. But there's some specific discoveries. We'll talk about these two important discoveries that kind of acted as a transition from studying human mind as a philosophical construct to studying human mind more as a scientific construct. And that would be around 1850s or so. So I would say mid 19th century. And because of those two discoveries, I would say the late 1800s, in other words, late 1900s to early 20th century, which is early 1900s, late 1800s to early 1900s. That's when uh, um, um, people interested in human mind started adapting scientific methods of studying it. But because this was like very first look at human mind more objectively. So there were several schools of thoughts, and these schools of thought basically differed in terms of what about human mind can and should psychology study, and about what methodology should scientists adapt to study human mind. So there were some differences, and then we'll talk more about this. But these are the two main, I think, things that differentiate these earlier schools of thought. In fact, the later schools of thought, the most current schools of thought, or the most current perspectives, actually evolved from these first early schools of thought, and you still see the debate about what methodology and what topic should we study, and that reflects in the current perspectives of psychology. Then the modern psychology, which would be mid 1900s to the current time, we'll talk about three or four current perspectives and talk about what the current perspective is in this timeline. So pre-scientific, as I said, it's from 300 to 500 to 300 BC. It's dominated by philosophers. There were Western and Eastern philosophers who were interested in human mind. So from Western philosophers, you have people like Socrates, Plato, Aristotle. And from Eastern philosophers, you have people like Confucius. Well, there were other Eastern philosophers, but we're only going to look at the Confucius and his work and his contribution to the current psychology. So when you talk about Western philosophers interested in knowledge in general and human mind at that time, well, you have to start with um, Socrates, right? Um, Socrates believed that you can get to the truth about anything, and it can be external world or it can be nature in general. And because we are part of the nature, or we are just one aspect of the nature, we can also study about humans or human behavior or human mind by adapting what is called as rational thinking. Um, and at some point, there is this really good quote which says that an unobserved life is not worth living, suggesting the importance of reflecting or rational thinking to really get to the truth, to the knowledge, in this case, knowledge about human behavior and mind. Well, Plato was the disciple of Socrates, and he also believed in a similar idea of the importance of rational thinking. Then you can see this another wave, like first wave of philosophers thinking about importance of logical thinking, but then came another wave with Aristotle, who who was a naturalist basically, and he was interested in observing natural, especially living organisms and their behaviors, and he relied more on observation. So for him, it's not just logically coming to the conclusion about the nature of truth about things, but you need to have objective observations, collect them, then use rational thinking to actually make conclusions about the nature. So in that sense, Aristotle kind of used the rational thinking, but added the importance of the observation, which I think is the basis for current way of looking at how scientists look at or psychologists want to study human behavior through observation. And of course, we use logic, but it'll make sense when we talk about that methodology later on. But Aristotle, so he believed in systematic observation, um, and he also wrote a lot at that time. He talked about association of thoughts, how your thoughts go from how you thoughts go from one thought to another thought as as a continuous chain of thoughts. And it also talks about the pain and pleasure, and how all our behavior is determined by these two constructs, the pain and pleasure. Now, the Eastern philosophers, on the other hand, had a different view of human life, if you may. And one of these philosophers that's well discussed in the psychology is Confucius. Now, according to this ideology, people are inherently good, and and whatever the bad that you see in human behavior, it is not a result of the individual himself or herself, but because of the effect the environment has on the individual. It could be lack of education or guidance or whatever it is. So you can think of the individual and the environment playing a role in determining the human behavior. Now, it's not directly related to the psychology per se, but again, this is about human behavior and how the environment influences the human behavior, the ideas about it. So this would be the first time somebody talked about the role of environment in shaping human behavior. That actually becomes a part of a school of thought, which we'll talk about later. So, according to Confucius, on a more moral, philosophical view, is that the discipline or the behavior of humans should be determined by moral principles, because we're inherently good. So, if our behavior is guided by moral principles, that's more um, desirable, as opposed to controlled by the environment, which with lack of moral principles. So that's the pre-scientific period, a period of philosophers. Next, we'll talk about the scientific period.